policy blueprint for reducing California's cost of living, energy, water, housing, and more. A theoretical state-level policy and zoning concept paper for California, focusing on family cost of living relief under legal and rights-based constraints. Introduction: California faces high living costs, from expensive energy and water to housing shortages, that strain family budgets. The following policy and zoning actions are explored as theoretical strategies to reduce cost of living pressures without compromising legal and ethical standards. We outline 6 focus areas: energy, water, housing, workforce integration, public land use, and public safety, detailing objectives, proposed mechanisms, legal constraints, economic impacts, and risks for each. All proposals are discussed as conditional and exploratory, given California's robust environmental protections, constitutional rights, and regulatory limits. Overview of strategies: the table below summarizes key theoretical policy tools, their intended cost of living benefits for families, and the main legal/regulatory considerations or risks associated with each. All proposals are analyzed as hypothetical scenarios, flagged with their feasibility and constraints. Proposed policy versus impact versus legal constraints. Policy proposal. Cost of living impact, goal. Legal and regulatory constraints. Expand in-state energy supply, oil/gas production, renewables, storage, transmission. Lower fuel and power prices, reduce reliance on costly imports, stabilize utility bills, create energy jobs. Environmental and climate, state fracking ban and strict oil drilling setbacks limit new fossil production, CA climate laws target phasing out oil by 2045. Federal/local, overlapping federal land jurisdiction, BLM defers to CA rules, new drilling often clashes with local bans permitted by recent laws. Market limits, state actions can't fully control global energy prices or guarantee lower retail costs, given interstate markets and global pricing of oil/gas. Boost water supply via desalination and interstate water transfers, coastal plants, partnerships to sell water to AZ/NV/UT/NM. More drop-proof water can stabilize or reduce water rates long-term. Revenue from interstate sales could offset high desal costs to CA ratepayers. Environmental and coastal law, CA Coastal Commission and State Water Board impose strict siting, intake, brine discharge and marine protection rules for desal plants. Eminent domain, legally permitted for public use but must pay just compensation and undergo SECA, likely local opposition. Interstate compacts, interstate water sales untested in Colorado River Basin, likely requiring federal and multi-state agreements. High cost, $/acre-foot from desal nearly 10 times higher than traditional water, raising profitability hurdles. Statewide zoning reform for housing, ADUs, duplexes, conversions, homeowner incentives, streamlining. Increase affordable housing supply, easing rents and enabling young families to find homes, more intergenerational living, e.g. ADUs for relatives, reduce homelessness risk via more units in market. State versus local control, strong state laws, e.g. SB 9, SB 35, preempt local zoning to allow ADUs, duplexes, but local governments may resist with restrictive ordinances. Environmental review, streamlining must still comply with SECA, though new laws are easing some SECA for infill housing. Fair housing, programs must avoid discrimination, direct incentives for youth or families should be open to all qualifying first-time buyers to satisfy equal protection. Homeless and offender workforce programs, voluntary, job training, public works, apprenticeships. Provides income and skills to at-risk groups, lowering homelessness and recidivism, addresses labor shortages in needed industries, e.g. firefighting, infrastructure, agriculture, via a new domestic workforce. Legal and ethical, participation must remain voluntary, forced labor or punitive work programs violate state and federal law, 13th Amendment prohibits involuntary servitude. Labor standards must provide fair wages, safety protections, and benefits, especially for hazardous jobs, e.g. CA's inmate firefighter program now mandates minimum wage and expedited expungement for participants. Funding and oversight, significant public funding needed for training, housing, support services, strong oversight to ensure no exploitation or rights violations. Public Land Development Initiative, selective sale/lease of state-owned lands for new communities or renewable energy, targeting new entrants. Eases housing pressures by unlocking new land for homes and industry, fosters rural jobs and affordable living options in inland regions, reduces state land maintenance costs by engaging private stewardship. Constitutional and environmental, any land grant must be open to eligible applicants, no discrimination by age, education, or status. Restrictions favoring certain groups would likely violate equal protection. Tribal and conservation, many unused lands have environmental or cultural significance, subject to SECA, NEPA, if federal lands, and potential tribal claims. Infrastructure costs, new settlements require roads, water, utilities, broadband, power, expensive investments and environmental mitigation needed. Viability depends on funding, environmental clearances, and local buy-in. Public safety investments, crime enforcement and prevention within legal bounds. Safer communities reduce costs of crime for families, personal loss, insurance, etc., and create stable environments for businesses and schools. Consistent enforcement of serious offenses deters crime and fosters public confidence. Legal boundaries must uphold due process, avoid unconstitutional punishments, e.g., California's death penalty is under a gubernatorial moratorium since 2019, effectively halting executions. Policing and prosecution, more policing must respect civil rights and avoid excessive force. Policy context, California focuses on data-driven policing partnerships, CHP and local police, that have reduced violence in some cities without extrajudicial measures. Support for reentry, mental health, drug treatment, housing, is crucial to address root causes of crime, consistent with evidence-based justice practices. All proposals above are theoretical and would require thorough legal vetting and stakeholder input before any real-world implementation. 1. Energy affordability and in-state supply. Objective and context, California's families face high fuel and electricity costs, partly due to the state's dependence on imported energy sources and a regulated market. Gasoline prices have consistently exceeded national averages, at one point in 2022 reaching $6.44 per gallon, over $2.60 higher than the U.S. average. Electricity and natural gas bills are also above national norms, straining household budgets. The goal is to explore whether increasing California's in-state energy supply, through both conventional and renewable sources, could alleviate energy costs for consumers, while remaining within legal and environmental constraints. Policy mechanisms, theoretical options. Expand conventional production, oil and gas. The concept is to boost in-state oil and natural gas extraction in existing fields, e.g., Vacaville oil fields, Kern County fields, to reduce reliance on foreign imports and expensive out-of-state fuel. California's oil production has declined. The state fell from 7th to 8th largest U.S. producer, now importing 75% of its oil from abroad. More local production could moderately improve refinery inputs and possibly narrow the California and Asian gasoline price gap, theoretically providing some relief on gas and utility bills. Diversify with renewables and storage, expand geothermal energy development, grid-scale battery storage, and transmission infrastructure to increase stable, locally sourced electricity supply. California already leads in solar and wind, but adding dispatchable sources, geothermal, long-duration storage, can reduce reliance on volatile gas-fired generation during peak demand, potentially lowering electricity costs over time by smoothing price spikes. The state could also invest in grid upgrades and regional transmission, partnering across western states, to import cheaper renewable power and avoid capacity shortfalls that drive up prices. Public utility regulation and consumer relief, use regulatory tools to ensure affordability, such as targeted subsidies or rate design changes. California's Public Utilities Commission, CPUC, can continue to enforce tiered electricity rates and lifeline programs, CARE, etc., to reduce bills for low-income families. The state's new gas price gouging and transparency law empowers the California Energy Commission to penalize extreme refining profit margins, aiming to prevent unjustified fuel price surges and protect consumers. Legal and regulatory considerations. Environmental and climate laws. California's climate policy strongly constrains expanding fossil fuel extraction. Hydraulic fracturing, fracking, was effectively banned statewide as of October 2024 under a CalGEM regulation initiated by Governor Newsom. In addition, new oil wells are prohibited within 3,200 feet of homes/schools per SB 1137, 2022. These measures, along with California's non-binding goal to phase out all in-state oil extraction by 2045, mean any theoretical push for new drilling would face major legal and political hurdles. Projects to restart idle wells or permit new ones would likely prompt litigation under CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, and conflicts with climate mandates. Geothermal and renewable projects also require permits and environmental reviews, but align better with California's climate objectives, making them more legally viable. Jurisdictional limits: California controls permits for onshore and state-owned offshore oil/gas resources, but significant oil fields lie under federal lands, e.g., parts of the San Joaquin Valley. While the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, BLM, manages these, it defers to state regulations for drilling and fracking. This effectively means California's restrictive rules also apply on federal lands within the state. Local governments can further restrict oil operations. A 2024 law, AB 3233, explicitly empowered cities/counties to ban or limit oil and gas development in their jurisdictions, even overriding state oil permits. Therefore, increased drilling is legally possible only in compliance with state environmental standards and where local authorities permit it. Market forces and infrastructure: even if new sources are developed, their impact on consumer prices may be limited. Gasoline and natural gas prices are influenced by global and national markets, especially since California lacks pipeline connections and uses specialized fuel blends. Additional in-state production might slightly mitigate import costs, e.g., shipping adds $5 to $6 per barrel to costs, but California's energy prices will still reflect broader market dynamics and state tax/regulatory costs. Any state intervention must also avoid violating interstate commerce rules. Direct price controls, for example, could conflict with federal jurisdiction over oil/gas markets. Economic and cost of living impacts. Fuel and power prices: the intended benefit is to moderate fuel and electricity prices faced by households. By increasing local supply, oil for gasoline and natural gas for power generation/heating, and diversifying energy sources, the state could reduce its exposure to price spikes. For instance, industry groups argue that California's heavy reliance on imported oil contributes to higher pump prices. More local production or alternative sources might provide some price relief, though likely incremental given California's broader regulatory costs, e.g., carbon cap and trade costs, high fuel taxes, and clean fuel standards. Expanded renewable energy and storage could help stabilize electricity rates over the long run by providing cheaper off-peak supply and reducing the need for costly gas-fired peaker plants. However, transitional investments, e.g., building new geothermal plants or batteries, require upfront capital and might increase near-term rates before yielding savings. Jobs and economic development: facilitating new energy production, whether oil drilling, geothermal, or solar/wind projects, could create construction and operations jobs, especially in high unemployment areas of the Central Valley or inland deserts. These industries can spur ancillary economic activity, benefiting families through employment opportunities. The trade-off is that large fossil fuel expansions would undermine California's leadership in climate change mitigation, and conflicts with environmental goals could deter investment or provoke public opposition. Risks and trade-offs. Environmental risk versus cost relief: the theoretical relaxation of drilling or fracking restrictions might modestly reduce energy costs but at the expense of environmental and public health. California's fracking moratorium was driven by concerns about water contamination and seismic risks. Overturning it would face strong opposition from environmental groups in communities near oil fields, and could lead to legal challenges for violating health protections or greenhouse gas reduction targets. Long-term versus short-term focus: expanding fossil fuel supply might conflict with California's long-term decarbonization targets and risk stranded investments as the world shifts to clean energy. Conversely, focusing solely on renewables and electrification, to ultimately reduce fuel costs by moving away from gasoline entirely, might not yield immediate cost of living relief for families still dependent on gas vehicles and natural gas appliances. Policymakers would need to balance immediate affordability concerns with climate commitments, potentially through transitional relief, like targeted rebates or a slower transition for household uses of natural gas, while still steering the energy system towards sustainability. 2. Water supply and desalination economics. Objective and context: California's recurring droughts and water scarcity drive up water bills for households and threaten economic stability. In urban Southern California, water agencies rely on long-distance imports from the Colorado River and Northern California, which are vulnerable to drought and legal cutbacks. Desalination of seawater offers a virtually unlimited source but at a high cost. The goal is to examine theoretical strategies for expanding desalination capacity and even pursuing interstate water exchanges, selling desalinated water to other states like Arizona or Nevada, to generate revenues that could reduce Californians' water costs. This section assesses how desalination can improve water affordability and reliability for families, and what legal/economic challenges such efforts face. Policy mechanisms, theoretical options. Scale up desalination plants, support development of new seawater desalination plants along the California coast, especially in the Los Angeles and San Diego regions, to supplement local water supplies. For example, one existing facility, the Carlsbad Desalination Plant in San Diego County, produces 56,000 acre-feet per year of potable water, about 10% of the region's needs, at full capacity. The state could identify suitable coastal sites, including possibly on state-owned land or decommissioned facilities, and use eminent domain if necessary to acquire land for large-scale desal plants dedicated to public water supply. Interstate water sales, explore agreements with neighboring states, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, to export some portion of California's desalinated water. This concept gained real traction in early 2026. The San Diego County Water Authority signed an initial agreement with Arizona and Nevada to sell surplus desal water from Carlsbad across state lines. The rationale is that California's advanced water infrastructure could produce extra supply to help other states meet their needs, especially as Colorado River allocations shrink, with out-of-state buyers effectively subsidizing the high cost of desalination. Such revenue could help make desalination financially viable and even reduce unit costs for California ratepayers. Governor Newsom expressed support for partnering on water transfers across the basin, including desalination to relieve pressure on the Colorado River system. Incentivize technological and scale efficiencies, encourage innovation and economies of scale to drive down desalination costs. This could involve state grants or public-private partnerships to invest in energy-efficient desal technology, co-locating desal plants with power sources, e.g. using waste heat or zero-carbon energy from Diablo Canyon Nuclear Plant for desal power needs. As an illustration, experts note that the 2,000 megawatts output of California's last nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon, could hypothetically produce up to 5 million acre-feet per year of desalinated water, potentially covering over half of urban demand, though actual projects of that scale would be unprecedented in the U.S. This indicates the technical potential if energy supply and regulatory hurdles were addressed. Legal and regulatory considerations. Coastal permitting and environmental review. California's regulatory framework for coastal desalination is complex and stringent. Projects must satisfy the State Water Resources Control Board's ocean plan provisions and obtain a coastal development permit. In 2022, the Coastal Commission denied a major proposed desal plant, Poseidon's Huntington Beach project, citing concerns about sea level rise, brine discharge, environmental justice, and wetland impacts. Any new desalination push would require addressing these concerns with robust mitigation measures, e.g. subsurface intakes to protect marine life, renewable energy to offset carbon emissions, and local environmental offsets. The permitting timeline can be long, uncertain, and involve SECA reviews and possible lawsuits by environmental groups. Eminent domain usage. The state has the power of eminent domain to secure sites for public water infrastructure, with fair compensation to owners. However, using this power for a desal plant might be controversial and legally contested. The state would need to clearly justify that the project serves a public purpose, drinking water supply, which is plausible, and follow required procedures, e.g. necessity hearings under California's eminent domain law. The use of eminent domain does not bypass environmental clearances. A desal site, especially on the coast, would still trigger environmental assessment and possibly federal review, e.g. Clean Water Act permits, Marine Mammal Protection Act if marine environment is affected. Interstate water transfer agreements. There is no direct precedent for large-scale interstate sale of desalinated water in the western U.S., so this approach would navigate uncharted legal waters. Interstate water rights are typically governed by compacts in federal law. For instance, the Colorado River Compact allocates water among 7 basin states, and changes usually need consensus and federal approval. California might need to negotiate new agreements or pilot water exchange deals, as being explored by western states in 2026. Additionally, state water code provisions and public trust doctrines could limit export if it harms California's own long-term water needs. Regulators would likely require that any exported water is truly surplus and that California users are secure first. Economic regulation. Desalination plants are capital-intensive, $1+ billion in construction, and financing typically involves long-term take-or-pay contracts where local water agencies guarantee to buy a fixed volume of water. This structure has led to underutilization when local demand drops, as occurred with Carlsbad, currently running at only 85% of capacity due to local conservation success. The involvement of multiple states would add complexity. Interstate water sales might need oversight by federal agencies, Bureau of Reclamation, or even congressional approval if new cross-border infrastructure is needed. The state must ensure such deals comply with anti-profiteering laws and do not conflict with any federal restrictions on transferring water out of state. Economic and cost of living impacts. Water rates for families. Desalinated water is significantly more expensive than traditional sources, which is the core challenge. Carlsbad's water costs around $3,500 per acre-foot, about $10 per thousand gallons, 10 times the statewide average cost, $3.43 per acre-foot. This currently raises water bills for local customers. The rationale for seeking out-of-state buyers is to improve plant utilization and spread costs. Selling the unused capacity to Arizona or Nevada could bring in revenue to offset local costs. If structured correctly, interstate sales could enable economies of scale, allowing new plants to be larger and run closer to full capacity, thereby reducing per-unit costs. In theory, this could eventually alleviate some of the upward pressure on water rates for California households, especially in drought-prone regions like Los Angeles and San Diego. Drought resilience and supply stability. For California's families, the biggest benefit of desalination is reliability, rather than low cost. Desalinated supply is drought-proof, ensuring that even in severe droughts, when imported water is restricted and prices spike, there is a baseline supply available. This can prevent the worst shortages and price surges during drought conditions. In the long run, widespread desalination combined with wastewater recycling could make urban regions largely independent of imported water, shielding consumers from drought-driven price volatility, albeit at a generally higher base cost of water. Regional economic effects. Building new large desal plants would generate short-term construction jobs and long-term operational jobs, e.g. plant technicians, in coastal communities. If interstate water commerce became viable, California agencies could generate revenue, turning water into an export commodity, potentially improving the state's trade balance and funding local water infrastructure. However, these benefits hinge on cost sharing across states and possibly federal support. Otherwise, high costs might render desal expansion uneconomical without heavy subsidies or steep water rate increases. Risks and trade-offs. Affordability versus environmental impact. Desalination trades financial cost for reliability. If pursued at scale without cost controls, it could raise water bills in the short term, a regressive burden on low-income families. Conversely, not investing in new supply could leave families vulnerable to rationing or emergency supply price shocks in future droughts. Any plan would need accompanying affordability measures, targeted bill assistance, for example. Environmental trade-offs are significant. Large-scale desal could impact marine ecosystems and coastal communities if not properly mitigated. This must be balanced against the environmental harm of depleting rivers and aquifers. Comprehensive planning could integrate desal with habitat restoration in other areas to net out environmental benefits. Interstate coordination uncertainties. The viability of selling water to other states is uncertain. Legal and political disagreements, e.g. whether upper basin states and the Colorado River Compact must approve such transfers, could delay or derail plans. Furthermore, profitability is not guaranteed. If other states balk at the high price of desal water, California might be left with stranded infrastructure. These risks mean any major desal expansion should be phased, adaptive, and likely reliant on federal facilitation, as some have proposed, e.g. using federal land and authority to override state regulatory barriers in national interest, an idea that underscores the exceptional measures required. 3. Housing affordability and family formation. Objective and context. California's housing costs are among the highest in the nation, with a median home price over $800,000, about double the U.S. average. Skyrocketing rents and home prices have driven many young adults and families out of state and contributed to homelessness. The state is estimated to have a housing shortage of 2.5 to 3.5 million homes, i.e., California needs to build millions more units to restore affordability. The goal is to explore state-level zoning and policy actions to spur housing supply and reduce costs, especially for families and first-time homebuyers, within legal bounds, no discriminatory targeting by age or status. In particular, the focus is on accessory dwelling units, ADUs, lot splits, and small unit conversions that empower homeowners to create more housing, plus support for first-time buyers and family-oriented housing. Policy mechanisms, theoretical options. State-mandated zoning reforms build on California's recent pro-housing laws to further deregulate local zoning for small-scale housing. For example, strengthen enforcement of ADU mandates in SB 9, the 2021 Duplex and Lot Split Law, so that homeowners can easily add backyard cottages, garage apartments, or split a single-family lot into 2 duplex lots. These laws already require cities to approve ADUs and 2-home projects ministerially, without discretionary review. Additional steps could include new legislation or state HCD, housing and community development, rules to nullify any local ordinances that indirectly impede ADUs, e.g. aesthetic requirements, excessive fees. Simplifying codes to allow internal subdivision of large homes into multiple studios, with safety codes intact, could also create more rental units for extended families or young renters. Incentives for homeowners and first-time buyers offer targeted incentives for homeowners to build and rent ADUs or small units, e.g. low-interest loans or tax credits for constructing ADUs, with bonus incentives if rented at affordable rates, all while being available to any homeowner, to avoid favoritism. For aspiring first-time homeowners, often younger households, the state could expand programs like down payment assistance or shared equity loans to help them purchase homes in newly upzoned areas. These programs must be open to all eligible first-time buyers, not explicitly age-based, but can indirectly benefit youth who otherwise could not afford entry into California's housing market. State preemption and streamlining use state law to streamline approval processes and override local barriers for small housing projects. California has already implemented measures like shot clocks for permits and limiting local hearings. Further strategies might require that every city plan for family-friendly housing types like duplexes and triplexes in all neighborhoods, with state oversight to ensure compliance. The legislature could also consider temporarily relaxing certain building codes, where safe, for small units, for example, flexible parking requirements or waivers of certain fees, to reduce costs and encourage faster development of modest-priced units. Legal and regulatory considerations. State versus local authority. California's constitution allows the state to set broad housing and zoning standards, but local governments traditionally control land use. Recent laws, SB 9, SB 10, ADU statutes, have set a precedent that the state can mandate denser housing allowances in single-family zones. These have held up under legal challenges so far. However, localities sometimes attempt to sidestep state mandates, e.g., by passing extremely strict objective design standards for ADUs. The state's response has been to tighten laws each year. For instance, a 2025 bill further nullifies illegal local ADU barriers. This indicates that while the state can push through comprehensive zoning reforms, ongoing enforcement, and possibly legal battles, citizen lawsuits to enforce or local suits challenging mandates, are part of the process. Any new mandates must be crafted to clearly override conflicting local regulations, e.g., explicit language preempting local occupancy rules or minimum lot sizes. Anti-discrimination laws. All housing programs must adhere to fair housing and anti-discrimination laws. The state cannot legally restrict programs to only high IQ or certain ethnic groups, etc., as that would violate equal protection. Instead, criteria like first-time buyer status or income level, as proxies for need, are permissible. Emphasizing youth specifically could raise issues of age discrimination, though favoring younger families indirectly via first-time buyer status is generally allowable, since older repeat buyers wouldn't qualify. Programs could also possibly allocate extra support to families with children, since familial status is protected in housing. Direct favoritism might be tricky, better to allow voluntarily if families are the ones who naturally benefit. The key is any new incentives must be open to all who meet neutral criteria, e.g., California residents who don't currently own property for a land grant program, etc., to avoid legal challenges. Environmental and building codes, upzoning and densification have environmental implications. While infill housing is generally SECA exempt or easier to clear, some 2025 laws even gave SECA exemptions for urban housing on up to 20 acres. Local project by project issues could arise, e.g., historic districts or coastal zones partially exempt from SB 9. Additionally, converting older homes into multiple units must still meet safety codes, fire, seismic. State law can't waive critical health/safety standards without potentially increasing risk, so a balance must be struck. Economic and cost of living impacts. Increased housing supply and lower rents. The central premise is that adding housing units will gradually moderate prices. California's ADU boom illustrates this potential. From 2016 to 2022, annual ADU permits soared by over 15,000%, from negligible numbers to tens of thousands per year, totaling 83,865 ADUs in that period. As of 2022, nearly 1 in 5 new homes in California is an ADU. These ADUs often provide lower-cost rental housing in existing neighborhoods, expanding options for singles, students, or seniors. By replicating this success with further zoning reforms, e.g., allowing even more small-scale units in all residential zones, the cumulative effect could be to relieve upward rent pressure over time. More duplexes, triplexes, and backyard homes in expensive metro areas would give families more choices, perhaps enabling multi-generational living, adult children or elderly parents staying nearby in an ADU, at lower cost than separate housing. Homeownership opportunities. State-facilitated small lot development and subsidized first-time buyer programs could help convert renters into homeowners, improving family financial stability. For example, lot splits under SB 9 allow creation of smaller, lower-cost parcels for new starter homes in established neighborhoods, like building a duplex where one house stood. If local implementation is strengthened, this can incrementally add to the inventory of entry-level homes. Additionally, expanded down payment assistance, akin to the 2022 California Dream for All program, would help more young families overcome the upfront cost barrier, though funding such programs at scale is a challenge. Homelessness prevention. While housing costs are not the sole cause of homelessness, they are a major factor. Advocates note that homelessness is fundamentally an income and housing availability problem. Expanding the supply of modest units, studios, ADUs, etc., can prevent some at-risk households from falling into homelessness by providing more affordable options. It also helps those currently unhoused. State efforts to convert motels and build tiny homes for homeless individuals rely on easing zoning and SECA hurdles to site these units. Risks and trade-offs. Timeline and backlog. Even aggressive zoning reforms take time to translate into actual housing. California's shortage, 2.5 million homes needed, 200,000 people unhoused, is so large that families might not see relief for years, potentially causing impatience or political backlash. Ensuring quick implementation, through streamlined permits and maybe fast-track prefab housing incentives, would be crucial to realize benefits sooner. Local pushback and political risk. While statewide reforms have accelerated housing production, there remains local opposition, NIMBYism. For example, communities could respond to state mandates with subtle deterrents, e.g., strict design rules or claiming utility capacity issues, requiring constant state vigilance. Additionally, upzoning everywhere can raise fears about neighborhood character and infrastructure strain, requiring careful public communication and possible infrastructure investments, better transit, schools, to support growth. Financial feasibility. Building housing in California is inherently expensive: labor, materials, fees. Loosening zoning may not automatically yield low-cost housing without tackling those cost drivers. There is a risk that new units, even small ones, still come in at rents or prices too high for lower-income families. Policy might need to pair supply-side changes with financing support or cost offsets, pre-approved plans for ADUs, reduced development fees, etc., to ensure the new supply is actually affordable, not just more luxury units. For homelessness and workforce integration, non-coercive approaches. Objective and context. High living costs and lack of jobs contribute to California's homelessness crisis, which affects roughly 170,000 to 200,000 residents on any given night. At the same time, certain industries face labor shortages in difficult or dangerous jobs, e.g., wildfire mitigation crews, farm labor, manufacturing, sanitation. Rather than punitive measures like forced prison labor or indefinite incarceration, which raise severe legal and ethical issues, the theoretical strategy here is to address both problems with voluntary workforce integration programs. The goal is to help people experiencing homelessness or exiting incarceration gain stable employment and housing, while filling high-demand job roles, all with full legal protections and support services. This approach aligns with evidence that employment can reduce homelessness and recidivism and must be pursued within the bounds of labor laws and human rights. Policy mechanisms, theoretical options. Voluntary public works employment creates state-funded programs offering transitional jobs and training in public works or conservation projects for homeless or unemployed individuals. This could be an expansion of models like LA Arise, a Los Angeles program connecting homeless individuals to jobs with social enterprise support, or the historic California Conservation Corps, which employs youth in environmental work. Projects may include forest management, wildfire fuel reduction, urban greening, infrastructure maintenance, or other public benefit tasks, providing participants with wages, shelter, and on-the-job experience. These roles should be voluntary, opt-in opportunities, not mandated assignments, and pay at least prevailing wages or training stipends. Apprenticeships in high-demand industries. Partner with unions and employers in industries like firefighting, CAL FIRE or municipal departments, construction trades, agriculture, or manufacturing to create apprenticeship pipelines for persons exiting homelessness or incarceration. For example, given California's year-round wildfire threat, expanding entry-level firefighting or forestry roles, with proper training and safety gear, could both address labor needs and provide purposeful work to participants, similar to the inmate fire crews concept, but done with post-release individuals or volunteers, and paying full wages. Another example, coordinate with agricultural associations to offer seasonal farm work programs that include housing on site, ensuring labor laws are fully respected. The emphasis is on earn and learn models where participants build skills and eventually transition to unsubsidized jobs. Supportive workforce housing, develop workforce housing campuses or expand existing shelter-to-work programs where homeless individuals who join these job initiatives can live in safe, decent housing during their training period. This could be modular dormitories or converted facilities on state land, with wraparound services like counseling or addiction treatment on site. The idea is to provide a stable environment for people to focus on work and skill building, a constructive alternative to punitive incarceration for those who want to rebuild their lives. Legal and regulatory considerations. Voluntariness in labor laws. It is paramount that no involuntary labor is imposed. Any work programs must be fully voluntary and participants free to leave, aside from standard work obligations they agree to. The 13th Amendment in California law forbid forced labor except as punishment for a crime after conviction, and even then, California voters in 2022 rejected a ballot measure that would have formally removed involuntary servitude for prison labor, meaning prison work requirements remain permissible but controversial. Given this context, the recommended strategy is to avoid coercive work for freedom schemes and focus on voluntary incentives. All participants should be considered workers or trainees, protected by California's extensive labor laws, e.g., OSHA standards for workplace safety, and at least minimum wage or prevailing wage requirements as applicable. In fact, recent California legislation, AB 247 in 2025, mandates that incarcerated wildfire fighters be paid federal minimum wage, up from just $1/hour previously, reflecting a legal and ethical shift toward fair compensation even for those in custody. Criminal justice coordination. For formerly incarcerated individuals, their participation might be part of parole or re-entry programs, which requires coordination with county probation departments and re-entry services. Programs like the state's Prison to Employment, P2E, exist to connect former inmates with jobs and have proven beneficial for reducing recidivism. Any program that involves current inmates, such as expanding prison fire camps, must navigate both state correctional regulations and 8th Amendment, no cruel or unusual punishment, implications. For instance, prisoner work programs must not be punitive or dangerous beyond what safety standards allow, and must include adequate training and protective measures. The ideal approach is focusing on post-release or voluntary pre-release programs that are structured as rehabilitation, with accelerated release or record clearing as incentives, consistent with recent reforms to expedite expungement for inmate firefighters. Funding and partnerships. Implementing large-scale workforce programs would likely require significant state budget allocations or federal grants. California already invests heavily in homelessness, billions in recent budgets for housing and services, so funds might be reallocated to these integrated work housing programs. Partnerships with private employers could reduce costs but must ensure no exploitation. Oversight mechanisms or wage requirements would be needed if private firms benefit from the labor, to avoid any modern indentured servitude scenarios. The state could also use social enterprises, nonprofits, as intermediaries to employ participants and contract out services, a model with some success in LA's programs. Economic and cost of living impacts. Consumer and social savings. These programs aim to increase participants' incomes, enabling them to afford housing and necessities, thereby directly lowering their cost of living burden, from homelessness to earning wages. Indirectly, families benefit from safer streets and reduced homelessness in communities. Persistent homelessness has high public costs. Emergency medical care, policing, sanitation. Studies indicate providing employment and housing is cheaper than leaving people on the streets long term. Thus, while programs have upfront costs, they may produce net savings for taxpayers and reduce intangible costs, like quality of life impacts of visible homelessness. Labor force expansion. By training marginalized populations, California increases its skilled workforce in sectors currently reliant on either migrant labor or experiencing shortages. For example, training more local workers in agriculture or construction can improve domestic labor supply, potentially reducing reliance on imported goods or out-of-state labor. Over time, integrating more people into the workforce broadens the tax base and consumer base, strengthening the state economy. Risks and trade-offs. Program effectiveness and retention. Not everyone facing homelessness or re-entering from prison can immediately succeed in a work program. Many need substantial mental health or addiction treatment first. There's a risk that if these programs are rushed or under-resourced, they could fail to retain participants, leading back to homelessness or recidivism. Adequate support and a housing-first foundation, ensuring stable shelter, are critical. A related risk is workplace injury in the high-risk jobs. Safety must be paramount to avoid harm to participants and liability to the state. Perception and ethics, even voluntary, these programs could face public skepticism if seen as exploiting vulnerable people for cheap labor. Transparent assurances of fair pay and genuine upskilling must be provided. The state's recent reforms to incarcerated firefighter pay show a recognition that even historically accepted practices needed improvement. The ethical viability of any program will rest on treating participants with dignity, as trainees/employees, not prisoners. Strict compliance with all labor laws and independent program evaluation will be needed to maintain public trust and legal integrity. 5. Public land use and rural development initiatives. Objective and context. California's government owns significant acreage of land, including state parks, school lands, and other public lands, much of it in rural or undeveloped areas. Managing these lands can be costly and may not always maximize economic value. Historically, land grant programs like the 19th-century Homestead Act spurred settlement and economic development by granting land to eligible citizens. The U.S. gave away over 160 million acres, 10% of all land, to 1.6 million homesteaders under these laws. However, those policies also displaced Native American tribes and introduced discrimination, e.g., excluding certain races. Today, any such initiative would face legal, ethical, and environmental constraints. The theoretical aim is to reduce state land management burdens and encourage new rural settlements and economic activity by making some public land available to private citizens or enterprises, focusing on those without existing land, but without violating modern laws or rights. Policy mechanisms, theoretical options. Modern homestead program, pilot. Conceptually, California could identify suitable state-owned lands, e.g., underused parcels that are not critical habitats or parkland, and offer them for lease to own or sale at minimal cost to individuals or families who commit to developing and residing on the land. This might be done via a competitive application focusing on the viability of the development plan, e.g., building a home, starting a farm or business, rather than personal attributes of the applicant. Priority could be given to first-time landowners or those who will use sustainable practices, to echo the spirit of the Homestead Act's focus on cultivation and improvement. Incentives or bonus land allotments could be considered for those who plan community-benefiting improvements, such as renewable energy installations, solar/wind farms, water infrastructure, or broadband facilities on their parcel, effectively rewarding developments that also enhance public goods. Public-private partnerships for rural infrastructure encourage settlement by aligning with rural infrastructure projects. For instance, coordinate with the state's broadband expansion, California's 2021 plan invested $6 billion for universal high-speed internet to ensure new settlements have connectivity, a key need for modern homesteaders to engage in online education, businesses, and remote work. Similarly, partner with counties to plan roads, schools, and utilities as needed, possibly funded by small fees on new land grants or through special assessment districts. The idea is to create new rural towns or communities in a planned way, rather than random scatterings, which reduces per capita infrastructure costs. Leasing and conservation-compatible development. In some cases, long-term leases or stewardship contracts might be preferable to outright land grants. This ensures the state can set conditions for environmental protection, public access, etc. For example, if state trust lands are leased for ranching or renewable energy with the requirement that the lessee invest in land management, fire breaks, habitat conservation, etc., the state could save on management costs and the lessee gains stable land access. If the lessee successfully improves the land over a period, similar to how homesteaders had to farm land for 5 years under the 1862 Act, an option to purchase or extend the lease could be provided. This approach tries to combine development with conservation duties, avoiding the land rush pitfalls of the 1800s. Legal and regulatory considerations. Public trust and disposal of state lands. California's laws on disposing of state land require a determination that the sale or lease is in the public interest and often legislative approval, especially if converting parkland or open space. Any program would require clear legislative authorization. Additionally, if federal lands were envisaged, like BLM lands, it would be beyond state jurisdiction and subject to federal constraints. The Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976 ended most homesteading on federal lands. This concept should focus on state-controlled lands to avoid federal entanglement. Equal protection and non-discrimination. A modern land grant program cannot select recipients based on subjective qualities, e.g., intelligence, education, or requiring U.S. birth, without running afoul of anti-discrimination laws. The original user concept of privileging high IQ or excluding green card holders would be illegal. Instead, neutral criteria like not currently owning land in California, or commitment to develop and occupy the land can be used. The program must be open to all qualifying Californians, which includes legal permanent residents, per federal housing discrimination protections regarding national origin. If multiple applicants compete, selection should follow fair processes, lotteries or scoring on objective criteria like feasibility of development plans. Environmental and cultural protections. Much of California's undeveloped land is undeveloped for good reason. It may be environmentally sensitive, critical habitat, water resource areas, etc., or carry significance for Native American tribes. State and federal environmental laws, SECA, Endangered Species Act, etc., would require thorough review of any plan to transfer or develop such lands. Additionally, tribal consultation is legally mandated if lands have cultural importance, per California AB 52 for SECA. There's also risk of conflicting with federal tribal rights if lands are subject to historical claims or federal trust responsibilities. Thus, a public land development plan must carefully screen parcels to avoid these issues, e.g., focus on degraded lands or those near existing development. Infrastructure and service delivery. Encouraging settlement in remote areas obligates the state and counties to provide emergency services coverage, fire, police, transportation access, and potentially schools, etc. These constitute fiscal and legal responsibilities, e.g., public safety obligations. The state must plan and budget accordingly, or require that new communities form special districts to self-fund these services, to avoid unsustainable situations. Economic and cost of living impacts. Land access for housing and business. By lowering the cost of land, often a major component of housing cost in California, a land grant/lease program could make homeownership or starting a farm/business more accessible to families who could never afford it at market prices. Essentially, it opens a path for households to invest sweat equity into building their home or enterprise. If successful, this could increase the stock of affordable homes, albeit in rural areas, and provide families a chance at property ownership, which is historically a key for wealth building and stability. Over time, new rural settlements might relieve some population pressures on coastal metros, indirectly easing housing demand in high-cost cities. Rural economic growth. The policy could spur growth of small towns, increasing agricultural production, helpful for state food supply, renewable energy projects if incentivized, improving energy supply, and local industries. New development means tax base expansion for counties currently dominated by tax-exempt public lands, potentially funding better local services without raising existing residents' taxes. Challenges and feasibility. On the flip side, families moving to remote areas may face higher transportation costs and less access to jobs, so this is not a near-term solution for most cost-of-living issues. The success depends on whether new economic opportunities, like telecommuting or new industries, can be established in these areas. The cost of living difference, cheaper housing but potentially longer commutes or less infrastructure, must be evaluated. Additionally, the state's cost savings on land management might be offset if it must invest in infrastructure for these new settlements, roads, utilities. A careful cost-benefit analysis would be needed to ensure the overall economic advantage. Risks and trade-offs. Environmental and social risks. Uncontrolled development of rural land can lead to sprawl, habitat fragmentation, and strain on water resources, especially if many new wells are drilled for domestic use. It could also reignite controversies akin to historical land dispossession if not handled transparently and fairly, thus, ensuring tribal engagement and environmental safeguards is crucial. There's also a risk that land might end up concentrated anyway, if, say, speculators find ways to exploit the system, which would defeat the purpose of creating new small landowners. Modern relevance. The Homestead-era strategy reflected a time of abundant free land and agrarian economy. In modern California, where technology and urban services dominate, pulling families to remote areas might not be broadly attractive unless coupled with robust support, internet, job opportunities. The take-up rate might be low, or conversely if high, it could create political friction if urban environmentalists oppose expanding development footprint. Thus, any such program would likely start very limited and experimental, to gauge viability. 6. Public safety and stability, rights-respecting approaches. Objective and context. California's families are not only concerned about economic costs but also the social stability and safety of their communities. Crime and public disorder can indirectly increase cost of living, through higher insurance, business closures, etc., and degrade quality of life. The original proposal included extreme measures like expanded capital punishment and prison camps for criminals, ideas that violate rights in current state policies. Instead, this section considers lawful strategies for enhancing public safety, consistent enforcement of violent crime laws and supportive interventions, all within constitutional limits and respecting civil rights. The goal is to reduce violent crime and recidivism, ensuring California remains safe and stable for families to thrive. Policy mechanisms, theoretical options. Strengthen law enforcement partnerships, build on proven models of state-local collaboration to target areas of high violent crime. For instance, in 2024 to 2025 the state deployed California Highway Patrol, CHP, crime suppression teams to assist local police in cities like Oakland and San Bernardino, resulting in thousands of arrests and significant drops in homicides and shootings. Expanding such initiatives statewide, as Governor Newsom has done for several metropolitan regions, can enhance patrol presence, focus on repeat violent offenders, and remove illegal firearms from the streets, all without any change to citizens' rights. Ensure consistent prosecution and sentencing. Work with county district attorneys and the judicial branch to ensure serious offenses like violent assaults, robberies, and repeat thefts are prosecuted and appropriately sentenced according to state law. In recent years, debates have raged over lenient prosecution in some jurisdictions, which some argue contributed to crime spikes in 2020 to 2022. The state can't dictate independent DOS decisions, but it can provide incentives or resources for activities like clearing backlogged cases, funding more prosecutors, or specialized task forces for things like organized retail theft. Additionally, targeted legislative tweaks, for example, refining theft thresholds or bail policies, can ensure that violent or chronic offenders are not quickly released without accountability, while still upholding due process and bail reform principles. Community-based prevention programs complement tough enforcement with violence prevention and rehabilitation. Increase support for proven programs like violence intervention, gang outreach, youth mentoring, and re-entry programs that reduce recidivism, aligning with the workforce integration approach above. Emphasize mental health and substance abuse treatment, addressing root causes that often underlie repeat offenses. This two-pronged approach, enforcement plus prevention, is crucial. Focusing solely on harsher punishment has diminishing returns if not paired with efforts to reform behavior and support at-risk individuals. Legal and regulatory considerations. Constitutional boundaries. California must operate within the U.S. Constitution and state law on criminal justice. Capital punishment, for example, is currently under a moratorium in California. Governor Newsom's 2019 executive order halted executions and dismantled the death chamber. Reinstating aggressive use of the death penalty, as the original prompt suggested, would not only face moral opposition, but also legal and practical barriers, since formal repeal would require voters to overturn the 2016 death penalty initiative and new lethal injection protocols, none of which is in place. Thus, a legal and rights-respecting strategy would steer away from expanding capital punishment, focusing instead on fully using existing sentencing laws, life imprisonment for egregious crimes, etc., under due process. Policing and civil rights. Any increase in police presence and enforcement must respect individuals' rights, Fourth Amendment, etc. Data-driven targeting of high-crime areas and repeat offenders, as CHP does with crime suppression teams, should be guided by crime data to avoid bias, and officers must be trained in de-escalation and culturally competent policing to maintain community trust. California's laws on police accountability, use of force standards, body camera requirements, etc., provide guardrails. Enhanced law enforcement activity might come under scrutiny for potential overreach, so oversight is key. Judicial/DA independence. The state can pass laws defining crimes and penalties, but independent prosecutors have discretion. Any attempts to directly mandate prosecution or remove a DA for policy differences quickly enters legally fraught territory. In extreme cases like clear malfeasance, state authorities can intervene, but that's rare. A cooperative approach, providing state funding for joint task forces or establishing minimum sentencing laws, within constitutional limits, might be more feasible. Economic and cost of living impacts. Reduced crime costs. Safer communities translate to lower direct costs for families, less property loss from theft or vandalism, potentially lower insurance premiums if crime rates drop, and fewer hidden taxes, like businesses raising prices due to theft losses. It's challenging to quantify precisely, but for example, a rash of organized retail thefts in California escalated costs that were passed on to consumers, prompting a state response. In 2023, the state made a record $267 million investment to help local law enforcement combat retail theft, which should reduce losses and price markups. Families also benefit from intangible peace of mind and quality of life when public spaces are safe and inviting. Business and investment climate. Public safety can affect the broader cost of living via economic channels. High crime can discourage businesses, reducing jobs, and depress property values in affected areas. Conversely, successful crime reduction efforts in cities like Oakland have coincided with drops in homicides and robberies, 20–30% declines in early 2025, which in turn encourage commerce and neighborhood revitalization. Over time, robust public safety keeps the social fabric stable, supporting steady economic development that ultimately benefits consumers, through job stability and choices of services. Risks and trade-offs. Civil liberties concerns. Overzealous enforcement without careful safeguards could lead to civil liberties violations or disproportionate impacts on minority communities, which in turn erode trust and long-term safety. California learned in prior decades, e.g., with three strikes law and very high incarceration rates, that purely punitive approaches can have social costs and diminishing returns. The trade-off is to find a balanced approach where violent and chronic lawbreaking is addressed firmly but fairly, with an emphasis on justice rather than vengeance. Resource allocation. Policing and jails are costly. If not managed smartly, focusing on violence prevention and rehabilitation, increased enforcement might drive jail/prison populations up and strain budgets. To mitigate this, focusing on violent and serious crimes, not minor offenses, ensures that resources are used where they have most benefit for public safety. Evidence-based strategies, like the aforementioned partnerships or focused deterrence programs, can yield safer communities without mass incarceration, reflecting the need to protect rights even as we protect the public. Conclusion. This theoretical policy plan outlines ambitious measures to jumpstart California's economy and reduce family living costs, from energy and water infrastructure to housing and workforce programs, while explicitly staying within legal and ethical boundaries. Each proposal involves complex trade-offs. For instance, boosting in-state energy output might marginally reduce fuel costs but conflicts with climate goals. Desalination improves drought resilience but at high price and regulatory complexity. Zoning reform can expand affordable housing but challenges long-entrenched local control. Policymakers would need to carefully balance these objectives with California's environmental mandates, budgetary constraints, and commitment to civil rights. By separating objectives, cost of living relief, economic growth, public safety, from means, the state can pursue innovative solutions without resorting to unlawful or coercive measures. The path forward likely lies in refining and scaling up existing successful programs, like ADU housing reforms or workforce reentry initiatives, and cautiously testing new ideas, e.g., interstate water sales or rural development pilots, in collaboration with stakeholders. Ultimately, ensuring California remains affordable for families will require holistic action across sectors, persistent legal creativity, and engagement with communities. This concept paper provides a blueprint for discussion, recognizing that any real implementation must go through rigorous legal vetting, legislative processes, and public input to become not just theoretical, but practical and just.